I'm just delighted to be here, and very grateful to you. But this is a very interesting room. I didn't know quite what. I feel as if I should be doing a dissection or something. But I'm absolutely thrilled and very grateful for so many of you to turn out tonight. This is it really wasn't that long ago that I did a reading to an audience of 5 people at a Barnes & Noble in Scranton, Pennsylvania. This is an absolutely true story. And of the 5 people, one was the store manager. So she obviously wasn't going to buy any books. And 2 others were friends of my parents who had retired to Pennsylvania and just wanted to know how my mom and dad were. The 4th was a guy whose name was also Bill Bryson. This is true, I'm afraid. And he had come all the way from some preposterous distance from Wilmington, Delaware, or Wheeling, West Virginia, or some out of state. Anyway, he'd come a huge way so that we could stand together and look at his driver's license and marvel at the fact that we were both named Bill Bryson. And then the 5th person was his wife, who didn't seem to want to be spending the evening with anybody named Bill Bryson. So this is fantastic for me. It really is. But I have to say, I'm also always a little nervous when I find myself in a situation like this, because there's something about just getting in front of an audience that always makes me feel that I really ought to try to say something significant or important. And I have to warn you at the outset that I'm one of those people that often blurts out the wrong thing. The example I always give is that some years ago I had to fill out an author questionnaire for a publication of W.H. Smith, a British bookstore chain. And one of the questions on the questionnaire was, what would you like people to be saying about you 100 years from now? It's quite a tough question when you think about it. And I thought really hard, what would I have people say about me 100 years from now if I could have them say anything? And the answer I gave was, and the amazing thing is he's still sexually active. So I apologize at once if I say anything wrong tonight. It's not because of lack of respect for the occasion, believe me. Now, one of the things that I think all writers, probably true to all writers, is that it's really, really very, very flattering to have people come out for you and to be recognized. I get recognized very, very occasionally in Britain because I do have a slightly higher profile there, but I'm never recognized in my own country, never. I mean, most writers aren't. I mean, if you think about it, there's a lot of writers that you wouldn't recognize if they weren't walking down the street. I wouldn't know John le Carré, for instance. But you do kind of crave it. And about a month ago, I was in Vail in Colorado because our youngest son got a job there. He graduated from college in England a year or so ago. But he took advantage of his American passport to go to Vail, and he got a job as a junior ski instructor. And then in the summertime, he works at a kind of outdoor adventure center. But it's very much an entry-level job, and they're not paying him very much. But he's having the time of his life, and he's made some really good friends, and they're sharing an apartment, and he's having a great time. And last month, my wife and I decided that we would fly out to Vail to visit him and see how he's doing. We hadn't seen him in a while. And while we were in Vail, he was still working, so we had to kind of fill the days. And on the 3rd or 4th day we were there, I was just shuffling around in downtown Vail, just looking in store windows and just kind of idly passing time. And somebody called out to me in a loud, clear voice, said, "Bill, Mr. Bryson." And I turned around, and this young man was advancing towards me with his hand out and a big smile on his face. And I was thrilled. I mean, this has never, ever happened to me before. And this guy coming up to me, and I shook his hand, and I said, "Hello, it's so nice to meet you." I said, how did you recognize me? And he said, "I'm one of your son's roommates. We had dinner with you 2 nights ago." So really, I can't thank you enough for making me feel important here tonight in Albany. Now, I don't really know quite what you expected me tonight. I wasn't going to talk just about 1927, the one summer. I was going to talk about, really just a little bit about who I am and what I do, and read to you a couple of passages from some of my earlier books, if that's okay. And then I was going to tell you, well, thank you. Thank you. You really are kind in Albany. And also I will at some point tell you my bear story, because I just love to tell my bear story. I always tell the bear story. So first, I suppose I should say a little bit about who I am. As Donald told you, I was born in Des Moines. I grew up there. People often, particularly in Des Moines, when they hear my voice, they say, you don't come from Des Moines, but I do. But I've lived away for so long that I guess I've lost quite a lot of my native accent and adopted some British accent. But I do genuinely come from Des Moines. I grew up there in the 50s, and it was just such a great time to grow up. I can see a lot of people who look approximately my generation in the audience tonight, and I think, I hope that you would all agree with me, it was a wonderful time to grow up. I think especially in the middle of the country, in the middle of the last century, and also in a nice, happy middle-class home, it was a great time to grow up. There was something about the 50s that was just so kind of wonderfully innocent. People from my parents' generation had all grown up through the Depression, and then they had to live through the Second World War. And then suddenly the 50s come along, and it's just this sort of consumer paradise. And everybody was so happy with this ability suddenly to acquire white goods in volume. And I remember very, very clearly, I honestly remember that, when my parents would get like a new refrigerator, they would have the neighbors in to look at it. And everybody would come in and kind of coo over this lovely new refrigerator. And there wasn't any sort of jealousy or boastfulness or anything about that. Everybody was, because it was this great shared prosperity, because your neighbors would, when they got a new stove or a washing machine or something, they'd have everybody in to look at that. And it was just such a wonderful, kind of deliriously happy time. Now, I was especially close to my mom. Both of my parents worked on the Des Moines Register, the local paper. And my mother is still alive, and she's just an absolute saint. I mean, she's just a wonderful person. But because she worked full-time, and this was back then, she was really under a lot of pressure all the time. Her typical day was that she went off to work. She had quite a demanding job at the Register, the local paper, and then she would come home every night about 5:30 or 5:45, having stopped at the grocery store on the way home, and she would just throw something in the oven and then charge off to some other part of the house to do all the thousands of chores that had piled up while she was away working at the office all day. And because of this, she was naturally forgetful anyway, but she would tend to put things in the oven and then forget them. So we didn't call it the kitchen in our house, we called it the Burns unit. But her particular specialty was that she would put things in the oven and forget to take the wrapping off them, so that I was nearly full grown before I realized that saran wrap wasn't a kind of chewy glaze. Anyway, the reason I'm telling you all this is this introduction to a passage I'd like to read to you from a book I wrote about growing up in Iowa in the 50s called The Life and Times of the Thunderbolt Kid. And this passage is to do with my dear old mother, who horrified me, mortified me by, in a very well-meaning way, she accepted an invitation on my behalf to go to a place called Lake Aquabi for the day with the Milton family, some neighbors of ours. Now, normally going to Aquabi for the day, Lake Aquabi, would have been would have been great news, because it was a very fun place to go, but not with the Miltons. The Miltons were the most obnoxious family you've ever seen. They were stupid and argumentative, and they ate horrible foods, and they just were it was just awful to be with them. But just trust me, it was just awful to be with them. And especially the boy who was my age was a kid named Milton. That wasn't really his real name, but the family did seriously have a long tradition of always giving the firstborn male the same first name as the family's last name. So it was a different name. The lawyers made me change the name, but they all know who they are. And so Milton was kind of the biggest drip in school, and to be with him for a day was just social suicide. So I couldn't believe it when I came home from school, and my mother, very happily with a big smile on her face, told me that she had accepted this invitation to go to Aquabi on Saturday, and it just filled me with dread and loathing and all bad feelings. But the thing I think was so magical about the 50s and growing up then, probably it's true of childhood altogether, but it certainly was of my childhood in that period, was how often, no matter how bad things seemed, how often they turned out for the best. Excuse me. I'm practicing very hard, taking a drink of water and then not burping in front of a room full of people, and I can't do it, so excuse me. So I went to Lake Aquabi in a mood of gloomy submission, crammed into the Milton's ancient dinky Nash, a car with the comfort and stylish zip of a chest freezer, expecting the worst and receiving it. We got heatedly lost for an hour in the immediate vicinity of the state capitol building, something that was almost impossible for any normal family to do in Des Moines. And when we finally reached Aquabi, spent 90 minutes more, with much additional disputation, unloading the car and setting up a base camp on the shady lawn beside the small artificial beach. Mrs. Milton distributed sandwiches, which were made of some kind of pink paste that looked like, and for all I know was, the stuff my grandmother used to secure her dentures to her gums. I went for a little walk with my sandwich and left it with a dog that would have nothing to do with it. Even a procession of ants, I noticed later, had detoured 3 feet to avoid it. Having eaten, we had to sit quietly for 45 minutes before swimming lest we get cramps and die horribly in 6 inches of water. Mrs. Milton timed this quiet period with an egg timer and encouraged us to close our eyes and have a little sleep until it was time to swim. Far out in the lake there was moored a large wooden platform on which stood an improbably high diving board, a kind of wooden Eiffel Tower. It was, I'm sure, the tallest wooden structure in Iowa, if not the entire Midwest. The platform was so far out from shore that hardly anyone ever visited it. Just occasionally, some teenage daredevils would swim out to have a look around. Sometimes they would even climb the many ladders to the high board, and even cautiously creep out onto it, but they always retreated when they saw just how suicidally far the water was below them. No human being had ever been known to jump from the high board at Lake Aquabi. So it was quite a surprise when, as the egg timer dinged our liberation, Mr. Milton jumped up and began doing neck rolls and arm stretches and announced that he intended to have a dive off the high board. Mr. Milton, it must be said, had been a bit of a diving star at Lincoln High School, but that was on a 10-foot board at an indoor pool. Aquabi was of another order of magnitude altogether. Clearly, he was out of his mind. Word of his insane intention was already spreading along the beach when Mr. Milton jogged into the water and swam with steady, even strokes out to the distant platform. He was just a tiny stick figure when he got there, but even from such a distance, the high board seemed to loom hundreds of feet above him. It took him at least 20 minutes to make his way up the zigzag of ladders to the top. Once at the summit, he strode up and down the board, which was enormously long, bounced on it experimentally 2 or 3 times, then took some deep breaths, and finally assumed a position at the fixed end of the board with his arms at his sides. It was clear from his posture and poised manner that he was going to go for it. By now, all the people on the beach and in the water, several hundred altogether, had stopped whatever they were doing and were just silently watching. Mr. Milton stood for quite a long time. Then, with a nice touch of theatricality, he raised his arms, ran like hell down the long board, and imagine, if you will, an Olympic gymnast running at full tilt towards a distant springboard, and you've got something of the spirit of it, took one enormous bounce, and launched himself high and outward in a perfect swan dive. It was a beautiful thing to behold, I must say. He fell with flawless grace for what seemed whole minutes. Such was the beauty of the moment and the breathless silence of the watching multitudes that the only sound to be heard across the lake was the faint whistle of his body tearing through the air toward the water far, far below. It may only be my imagination, but he seemed, after a time, to start to glow red, like an incoming meteor. He was really moving. I don't know what happened, whether he lost his nerve or realized that he was approaching the water at a murderous velocity, or what. But about 3/4 of the way down, he seemed suddenly to have second thoughts about the whole business and began suddenly to flail, like someone entangled in bedding in a bad dream, or whose parachute hasn't opened. When he was perhaps 30 feet above the water, he gave up on flailing and tried a new tack. He spread his arms and legs wide in the shape of an X, evidently hoping that by exposing a maximum amount of surface area, he would somehow slow his fall. It didn't work. Mr. Milton hit the water, impacted really is the word for it, at over 600 miles an hour. with a report so loud that it made birds fly out of trees up to 3 miles away. At such a speed, water effectively becomes a solid. I don't believe Mr. Milton penetrated it at all, but just bounced off it about 15 feet, limbs suddenly very loose, and then lay on top of it, still like an autumn leaf, spinning gently. He was towed to shore by 2 passing fishermen in a rowboat and carried to a grassy area by 6 onlookers who carefully set him down on an old blanket. There he spent the rest of the afternoon on his back, arms and legs bent slightly and elevated. Every bit of frontal surface area on his body, from his thinning hairline to his toenails, had a raw, abraded look, as if he had suffered some unimaginable misfortune involving an industrial sander. Occasionally, he accepted small sips of water, but otherwise was much too traumatized to speak. Later that same afternoon, Milton Jr. cut himself with a hatchet that he had been told on no account to touch, so that he ended up bleeding, in pain, and in trouble all at the same time. It was the best day of my life. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. I'm always in a slightly awkward position with these presentations because, I write 2 different kinds of books, really 2 quite different kinds. One is, intended to be amusing and not to be taken too seriously, although nothing I ever write is fictitious, Donald. To be goodness, what a thought. He really did hit the water at 600 miles an hour. I was there. But also I sometimes write slightly more serious books in which I hope they're entertaining, but the idea is not to just be entertaining, the idea is also to kind of convey information. And that is the case with this book that Donald was talking about, and that I would like to talk to you about very briefly, if I may. It's called, this is what it looks like, it's called One Summer, America 1927. And the whole idea of it, as he suggested, is that I was always fascinated by the idea that, man, there has a copy too, God bless you, sir. I was always fascinated by the idea that Babe Ruth and Charles Lindbergh both had their peak years, their career years, in the same summer. And I really just think it might be an interesting exercise to try to write a dual biography of these two very iconic figures, and with the idea of the narrative moving towards sort of intersecting in the summer of 1927. And then, as Donald also told you, I discovered that all kinds of other things happened that summer. I mean, it just was the most amazingly eventful and magical summer ever, I think, any nation has ever had, certainly in peacetime, because you also had the filming of The Jazz Singer, the first talking picture, which totally transformed popular entertainment. You had the invention of television. They started carving Mount Rushmore. You had the execution of the notorious anarchist Sacco and Vanzetti. You had Al Capone make the mistake that led to his downfall and kind of brought prohibition crumbling down with it. And just one thing after another, the Great Mississippi Flood, all kinds of things. It was just an amazingly eventful summer. And because it was so eventful, and because for me, in doing the book, it was really, all of this was a discovery. I was really set off with the idea of just doing this dual biography, and then I found there was all this other stuff happening. That's why it became a book about the summer rather than about just these 2 guys. And because for me it was such a kind of exciting period of discovery, finding all of these things happening, one really quite consequential thing after another, I don't like to talk about it too much. I don't want to, I'm hoping that if you read it, it'll be a sort of voyage of discovery for you too. So I don't like to tell people too much about it, because it seems to be that it's kind of a spoiler. So what I'd like to do, if just to satisfy sort of my contractual obligations to my publishers in New York, is just read you a short passage, just a really short passage to give you a kind of taste of what the book is about. And this passage is to do with Charles Lindbergh, who really was one of the most extraordinary figures in the whole 20th century, and for all kinds of reasons. But at the time of the summer of 1927, he really came from out of nowhere. I had never really thought about what he did. I mean, I'd always just assumed that he had somehow independently gotten it into his head that he would fly the ocean and land in Paris, and then in so doing he made himself famous. What I didn't realize was that there were lots and lots of other teams, 8 or 10 altogether, that were all better equipped and in much bigger planes, and that were in much stronger positions to get there first. ready to go. And for various reasons, they failed to take off when they might have. And then so out of nowhere, this 25-year-old kid from Minnesota who had only been flying for 4 years, nobody knew anything about him. The New York Times actually misspelled his name just before the flight because he was that obscure. This kid flies in and announces a plan to fly alone from New York to Paris and to try and win this $25,000 prize that everybody else was going for. Now, everybody thought he was completely out of his mind. He was going to go in a single-engine plane. Everybody else had multiple engine planes. And he was going alone, without a navigator or co-pilot or even a radio. He was going to try and do everything himself. It was just suicidal. Everybody thought he was mad. But because of that, and because he was sort of boyishly good-looking and personable and modest, the world became absolutely entranced with him. And when he took off, the world was just so full of excitement to see how he would do. When he took off, of course, in those days, because of the technology, once he disappeared out over the ocean, nobody on Earth, except Lindbergh himself, had any idea where he was. The whole world had to wait breathlessly for some 16 hours until he reappeared at the other side, when he first flew over Ireland and it could be confirmed that he had made it across. And by that point, the whole world just went berserk. It was just so ecstatic. Everybody everywhere was just filled with joy. And the interesting thing is that Lindbergh himself, flying in his plane, had no sense of that at all. As far as he knew, he was still completely, virtually anonymous. That's the background to this passage. Excuse me. As Lindbergh covered the last leg from Cherbourg to Paris, he had no idea that he was about to experience fame on a scale and of an intensity unlike any experienced by any human being before. It never occurred to him that many people would be waiting for him. He wondered if anyone at the airfield in Paris would speak English, and if he would be in trouble for not having a French visa. His plan was that first he would see to it that his plane was stowed securely, then he would cable his mother to give her the news that he had arrived. He supposed there would be 1 or 2 press interviews, assuming reporters worked that late in France. Then he would have to find a hotel somewhere. At some point, he would also need to buy clothes and personal items because he hadn't packed anything at all, not even a toothbrush. A more immediate problem confronting him was that his map didn't show Le Bourget, the airfield. All he knew was that it was some 7 miles northeast of the city and that it was reportedly big. After circling the Eiffel Tower, he headed in that direction, but the only possible sight he could see was ringed with bright lights, as if it were some kind of vast industrial complex, with long tentacles of additional bright lights stretching out from it in all directions. This was nothing like the dozing airport he had expected to find. What he didn't realize was that the activity below was all for him. The sinuous tentacles of light were the headlights of tens of thousands of cars, all spontaneously drawn to Le Bourget and now caught in the greatest traffic jam in Parisian history. Cars and trams were abandoned all along the roads to the airport. At 10:22 p.m. Paris time, precisely 33 hours, 30 minutes, and 29.8 seconds after taking to the air, the Spirit of St. Louis touched down on the grassy spaciousness of Le Bourget. In that instant, a pulse of joy swept around the earth. Within minutes, the whole of America knew he was safe in Paris. Le Bourget was instantly a scene of exultant pandemonium as tens of thousands of people rushed across the airfield to Lindbergh's plane. An 8-foot-high chain-link fence that surrounded the field was flattened, and several bicycles were crushed under the mass of charging feet. A measure of the pandemonium is that the next day cleaners would gather up more than a ton of lost property, including 6 sets of dentures. For Lindbergh, this was an entirely alarming circumstance, as he was trapped and in actual danger of being pulled to pieces. The throngs hauled him from his cockpit and began to carry him off like prized booty. I found myself lying in a prostrate position up on top of the crowd, in the center of an ocean of heads that extended as far out into the darkness as I could see, he reported later. It was like drowning in a human sea. Someone yanked his leather flight helmet from his head, and others, worryingly, began to pull at his clothing. Behind him, to his greater alarm, his beloved plane was being ruined by the swarms climbing over it. I heard the crack of wood behind me when someone leaned too heavily against a fairing strip, he reported later. Then a second strip snapped, and a third, and there was the sound of tearing fabric. Somehow, in the confusion, he found himself on his feet and the crowd moving past him. Miraculously, in the poor light, their focus switched to a hapless American bystander who bore a passing resemblance to Lindbergh, and they now carried him off, wriggling and protesting vehemently. A few minutes later, officials in the airport commandant's office were startled by the sound of breaking glass and the sight of the unfortunate victim being passed through the window to them. Wild-eyed and bedraggled, the new arrival was missing his coat, his belt, his necktie, one shoe, and about half his shirt. He looked rather like the survivor of a mining disaster. He told the bemused officials that his name was Harry Wheeler and that he was a furrier from the Bronx. He had come to Paris to buy rabbit pelts and had been drawn to Le Bourget by the same impulse that had attracted much of the rest of Paris. Now he just wanted to go home. Well, I'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, your reward, I think, for listening to that so patiently and quietly was that I will tell you the bear story now. Because the bear story, I've been telling this for years, so I love this story. I can take no credit for it because somebody else told it to me. But it's an outgrowth of an experience I had a good few years ago now when I tried to hike the Appalachian Trail in the company of my old pal Stephen Katz. We catastrophically failed to hike the Appalachian Trail from end to end, but it was a wonderful experience, if a completely challenging one. And if you've read the book, A Walk in the Woods, you'll know that I did genuinely grow somewhat preoccupied with the dangers of bear attacks while hiking in the eastern woods, because bears do sometimes attack. And I was delighted to discover after the book came out that lots and lots of people all over North America shared these concerns, because I got letters by the sackful from people giving me advice on how to avoid bear attacks while hiking. And here the basic advice seems to be always to go hiking with someone who can't run as fast as you can. But there was one letter I got from a lady in New Hampshire where I was then living that particularly pleased me. And she told me that when you go hiking out west in grizzly bear country, and grizzly bears are, of course, very dangerous creatures, there are two things they tell you everywhere you go. They tell you that, first of all, you should wear little bells on your clothing, because this alerts the bears you're coming and you don't overtake them by surprise. And the second thing they tell you should do is that you should watch out on the ground in front of you for grizzly bear scat, or dung. And the way you can recognize grizzly bear scat is that it has little bells in it. Thank you. Now, there's a second reason I'm really, really pleased to be here. Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons, but there's a second primary reason. And Donald also referred to that, and that is that I'm here in America, back home, for the whole month. I'm here until November 3rd, which means that I will be here for the whole of the World Series. And I can't begin to tell you how excited that makes me. You've no idea what a sacrifice it is for me to be here with you now while the Red Sox are playing. So that's how much I like and admire you. But I did want to tell you a true story that sort of sums up my feelings towards baseball. That my dad, as Donald told you, was a sports writer for the Des Moines Register, a really good one. And although it was a minor league city, his big treat every year was that he was sent to the World Series. The paper sent him to the World Series, wherever it was, every year. And for 40 years he went. And it was far and away the biggest event of his year. He got very excited a month before it was time to go, and he would start, haul his bag down from the top shelf in his closet, and he would start to fill it up and carefully make his selection of loud, flashy ties and sports coats and all of that, because it was such a big deal to him. And then he would go off to the World Series, and he'd be gone for 2 or 3 weeks. And when he came home, he would tell us, regale us with stories about, not only about the great baseball players of that period, and you'll forgive me for thinking that they were spectacularly great baseball players, Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle and all those people. He would tell us about them, but also he would be telling us about all these magical, exotic cities he'd gone to, which New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco and so on, places that seemed really quite marvelous to someone like me growing up in Des Moines, Iowa. So I grew up with this sense that going to the World Series was the most magical and worthwhile activity any human being could engage in. I really did. And it was something I always wanted to do. Really, really ached to go to a World Series, any World Series. And never got there. And I got to do lots and lots of other things. different publications sent me to the Soccer World Cup in Japan and to the Olympics in Sydney and to all kinds of fantastic and magical events, but I just never made it to a World Series. And then exactly 10 years ago, slightly earlier than before the playoffs began, but as the season was coming to a close, a very good friend of mine who's the sports editor of the London Times and a man who knew a lot about baseball called me up at home in England and said to me, "Hey Bill, have you been following the major leagues?" And I said, "Have I ever?" Because what was happening at this time in 2003 as the season was coming to a close was that the two teams that had the most momentum going into the World Series were the Chicago Cubs and the Boston Red Sox. Now, at this time, the Red Sox, of course, have had a lot of success in the last 10 years, but at this time, the Red Sox still hadn't won a World Series since 1918. And the Cubs, bless them, hadn't won one and still haven't won one since 1908. So these two teams had something like 180 years of collective failure between them. And yet it looked seriously for a while as if these were the two teams that had the best chance of getting into the World Series. And had they done so, it would have been the most exciting World Series in modern times, because one of them would have had to break this long drought, and it would have just brought joy either to Chicago or Boston in sort of unprecedented volumes. So it would have been a magical World Series. And Keith, my friend from the London Times, said to me on the phone, he said, "Look, Bill, we've been talking about it here at the office, and if it is the Cubs and the Red Sox this year in the series, we're wondering if you would go and cover it for us, because we think it would take an American to explain the improbable momentousness of this event to a British readership. So would you be interested in going?" And I said, "Would I be interested? Keith, I'll go for free. I'll go. Honestly, you don't have to pay me anything. Just get me tickets to the ballparks and a hotel room in each city. I'll take care of everything else. You don't have to pay me a penny." I really mean that. I said, "In fact, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to go and get my desk diary, and I'm going to bring it back here, and I'm going to enter this in ink, and you're going to confirm it over the phone now, and you're never going to be allowed to renege on this, because you would break my heart. You would devastate me. So we just have to be clear. We're agreeing to this here and now." So I went and got my desk diary, and I brought it back, and I opened it up to the appropriate page, and I made a crestfallen noise, and I said, "Keith, I can't believe it, but I can't go to the World Series this year because it so happens that my daughter is getting married that week." And he was quiet for a long moment, and he said, "Look, Bill, your daughter may get married again." So the next year, it was the year that the Red Sox broke their long drought, and he did send me. I got to go in 2004, and it was just magic. It was just magic. Well, no, you don't. I expected you to applaud, but it was just really fantastic for me. But now, I do love baseball, and the idea of being here for the World Series is extremely exciting. Now, in order to make sure there's plenty of time for questions, and hope that there will be some, I'm going to just read you one more short passage, and then we'll throw it up into questions. This is a passage about another country that I'm extremely crazy about, and that's Australia. And I went there in 2000, in 1992 for the first time, and fell for it in a big way, and then went back a few years later to write a book about it. And I go to Australia whenever I can, because I just think it's a fantastic country. And I didn't really expect to fall for it in a big way. I mean, I didn't expect to dislike it, but I didn't think that I would just kind of fall head over heels for it. But I did. And a big part of the reason that I did was because of my very oldest friend there was a woman named Catherine Veach. And she was my oldest friend in every sense of the word, because she was the first Australian I met when I went to Australia for the first time in 1992. I went to the Melbourne Writers' Festival. And she was also my oldest friend in a literal sense, because she was just about old enough to be my mother. But she came up to me at a reading I did at a much smaller venue than this, and after I'd finished, she came up and just to take issue with me in a very nice way about some assertion I had made about Australia. And she corrected me, and we got to talking, and we formed this kind of improbable friendship. And she eventually quite soon invited me out to her home in a suburb of Melbourne called St. Kilda. And I got to meet her husband and her kids, who were all more or less my age. And I became a really good friend of the family. They were delightful people. So that's the background to this passage. So we became great friends, though it was a friendship based almost entirely on correspondence. Catherine had never been to America, and I went to Australia once a year if I was lucky, and then not always to Melbourne. But 3 or 4 times a year she would send me long, wonderfully discursive letters hammered out on a jumpy and willful typewriter. These letters seldom took less than an hour to read. In a single page they could range over a galaxy of subjects: her childhood in Adelaide, the inadequacies of certain politicians, why Australians lack confidence, what her children had been up to. Generally, she stuck in a wadding of clippings from The Age, the Melbourne newspaper. Much of what I know about Australia I learned from her. I loved those letters. They came from so far away. Just getting an envelope from Australia still seemed to me a faintly wondrous event, and described experiences that were unexceptional to Catherine but breathtakingly exotic to me. Taking a tram into the city, suffering through a heat wave at Christmas time, attending a lecture at the Royal Melbourne Institute, shopping for curtains at David Jones, the big local department store. I can't explain it except to say that without giving up any part of the life I had already, I wanted intensely to have all that in my life as well. So it was through her letters, more than from almost anything else, that I consolidated my fixation with Australia. Her letters were always happy, but the last one I received from her was especially sunny. She and John, her husband, were about to sell their house in St. Kilda and move to the Mornington Peninsula, south of the city, to take up a life of gracious retirement beside the sea. Just after she sent that letter, to the shock of everyone who knew her, Catherine suffered a sudden heart attack and died. I'd have been on my way to visit her now. Instead, all I can offer is my favorite of the many stories she told me. In the 1950s, a friend of Catherine's moved with her young family into a house next door to a vacant lot. One day, a construction crew turned up to build a house on the vacant lot. Catherine's friend had a 4-year-old daughter who naturally took an interest in all the activity suddenly going on next door. She hung around on the margins, and eventually the construction workers adopted her as a kind of mascot. They chatted to her and gave her little jobs to do, and at the end of the week presented her with a little pay packet containing a shiny new half-crown coin. The little girl took this home to her mother, who made all the appropriate cooings of admiration and suggested that they take it to the bank the next morning to deposit in the little girl's account. When they went to the bank, the teller was equally impressed and asked the little girl how she had come by her own pay packet. "I've been building a house this week," she replied proudly. "Goodness," said the teller, "and will you be building a house next week too?" "I will if we ever get the fucking bricks," answered the little girl. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.